A group of monks lit a fire in their lab and nearly burned the world down with it. They weren't soldiers, they weren't engineers, they were Taoist alchemists in 9th century China, somewhere in the mountains of Sichuan or Shanxi, chasing something far stranger than warfare. They wanted to live forever. For years they mixed minerals in the dark, heating and testing, following recipes passed down through generations of mystics before them. They believed the right combination could grant eternal life. Instead, one batch gave them something else entirely. Saltpeter, charcoal, sulfur, 3 ordinary substances that, combined, did something no elixir ever had. It didn't heal, it didn't preserve, it exploded. Old records described singed beards, burned-down workshops, chaos nobody expected from a jar of powder meant to cheat death. Nobody in that room was trying to build a weapon. They named it Hua Yao, fire medicine, a name that still remembers what it was supposed to be, a failed cure, not a future conqueror's tool. And yet that one accident, born from a search for immortality, became the single most consequential chemical discovery in the history of human conflict. Every gun, every cannon, every firearm that would ever exist traces back to that scorched room. So how did a failed Prussian become a weapon that reshaped the world? The answer runs through bamboo tubes lashed to spears, through a siege that proved fire itself could be aimed, through centuries of trial, failure, and refinement, carried slowly across an entire continent until the balance of power on every inhabited landmass had changed forever. Start with the mixture itself, because the chemistry explains everything that came after. The ratio was roughly 75 parts saltpeter, 15 parts charcoal, 10 parts sulfur by weight. Saltpeter acted as an oxidizer, releasing oxygen violently when heated, feeding a burn so fast it barely resembled fire at all. It was closer to a controlled detonation. That expanding gas was the secret. Whether it lit up a night sky in celebration or launched a metal ball through armor, the mechanism never changed, only the intention did. For generations, that's exactly what gunpowder was. Celebration, not conquest. Fireworks, smoke signals, festival spectacle. Ordinary people across China grew up watching it light up temples and festivals, color and noise with no connection to war at all. Then, military commanders during the Song dynasty looked at the same substance and saw something else entirely. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, Chinese engineers built the huaqiang, the fire lance. It was almost insultingly simple, a bamboo tube strapped to a spear, packed with gunpowder, lit in close combat. The result was terrifying to face, a weapon that didn't just cut, it burned. Fire and debris exploded outward at anyone within arm's reach, turning an ordinary spear into something no soldier had trained to defend against. Defenders proved it worked during the siege of Dayan in 1132, using fire lances against attackers climbing the walls. Soldiers trained their whole lives to fight blades and spear points, not flame itself. That shock mattered as much as the burns. Fear moves armies just as much as steel does. Once gunpowder proved itself in real combat, innovation moved fast, and every step followed logically from the one before it. Fire lance makers began packing pellets and pottery shards into the bamboo alongside the powder. Suddenly the weapon didn't just burn, it wounded from a distance. That single shift from fire to projectile became the foundation every future firearm would build on. But bamboo had a limit. Push the charge too far and the tube split apart in the user's own hands. So Chinese craftsmen turned to bronze, strong enough to hold the pressure, and the hand cannon was born.
By the 13th century, Metal-barreled hand cannons were common across China. A single soldier could now launch a solid projectile farther and harder than any flame-spewing bamboo tube ever managed. Engineers scaled the idea further still, building devices called the thunderclap bomb and the heaven-shaking cannon, weapons that could crack open fortresses once thought unbreakable. Then the Mongols arrived. During their invasion of China in the 1200s, they encountered these gunpowder weapons directly, most notably during the defense of Kaifeng in 1232. They didn't just lose to the new technology, they absorbed it. Once the Mongols conquered China and founded the Yuan dynasty, they carried gunpowder weaponry with them as they pushed westward, across Asia, toward the Islamic world, and eventually toward Europe. It's one of history's most underappreciated technology transfers. Mongol conquest became an accidental delivery system, spreading a Chinese invention across the width of an entire continent faster than trade routes or diplomacy ever could. Gunpowder didn't just travel a single road either. Alongside hand cannons, Chinese engineers were also developing rockets and fire arrows, gunpowder-propelled projectiles that found their way into Korea, into India, and beyond, following different but overlapping paths westward. Those rocket weapons never disappeared the way fire lances eventually did. They lingered, a separate branch of the same discovery, one that would resurface centuries later in European warfare, and much later still in the earliest ancestors of space rocketry itself. One accidental discovery, two entirely different futures, the gun and the rocket, both born from monks who wanted neither. From there, the knowledge spread outward through trade, conquest, and contact, reaching the Islamic world and eventually Europe by the 13th and 14th centuries. It moved alongside paper, printing, and the magnetic compass, part of a much older wave of east-to-west exchange, centuries before anyone had a word for globalization. Some historians point out that early European cannons resemble Chinese designs so closely that direct transfer seems far more likely than coincidence. Two civilizations didn't stumble onto the same idea by accident. One learned it from the other. When gunpowder reached Europe in the late 13th century, it landed in a world built on castles, knights, and centuries of feudal military tradition, a world it would slowly and permanently dismantle. It didn't happen overnight. Early European hand cannons were crude, slow, and nearly impossible to aim, a small tube on the end of a pole. You packed powder and shot into the muzzle, touched a burning ember to a hole, and hoped. But even crude, it changed everything. Castle walls that had withstood sieges for generations began to fall to cannon fire. Knights in full-plate armor, the most feared force in medieval Europe, found themselves vulnerable to a weapon that didn't care how much steel they wore. An entire social order built on expensive armor and lifelong training began to crack. A cheap weapon in the hands of a far cheaper soldier could now bring down a warrior who had spent a fortune preparing for a different kind of war. Castle architecture itself had to change. Tall stone walls, built to repel arrows and scaling ladders, became death traps against cannon fire. Engineers responded with the star fort and the bastion, low, angled, reinforced structures built specifically to absorb and deflect artillery instead of standing tall and hoping. The medieval castle, a symbol that had defined Europe for centuries, was quietly being replaced, all because of a weapon born from monks chasing eternal life on the other side of the world. The next great leap came in the late 15th century, the matchlock. Earlier hand cannons needed two hands and perfect timing, one to hold the weapon steady, one to touch fire to the powder, all while trying to actually aim at something moving.
The matchlock solved it elegantly. A slow-burning cord, held in a curved clamp called a serpentine, was mounted directly onto the weapon. Pull the trigger, and the cord dropped into the priming pan on its own, freeing both hands to aim. It sounds small. It wasn't. For the first time in history, a single soldier could fire a gunpowder weapon with real aim, not just point and hope. By the early 1500s, matchlock arquebuses were spreading fast across Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, and from there across the breadth of Eurasia. The Ottoman Empire, already experienced with gunpowder since the 14th century, folded matchlocks into its elite Janissary corps, using them to devastating effect at battles like Goa in 1510. In 1543, Portuguese traders brought matchlocks to Japan. Japanese gunsmiths refined the design so precisely that their Tanegashima muskets became some of the most respected firearms in the world, praised even by European craftsmen. And China, where this entire chain began, ended up reabsorbing an improved version of its own invention, building matchlocks called bird guns to fight off Mongol incursions on its northern frontier. A strange, fitting loop for a weapon born from a failed potion in that same region centuries earlier. These early matchlock muskets grew heavy, some nearly 25 pounds, requiring a forked rest just to hold steady. But they could punch through plate armor at ranges no sword or pike could match. Because reloading left a soldier exposed, musketeers needed protection, usually pikemen standing beside them. This pairing, pike and shot, dominated European battlefields from the 1500s into the early 1600s, a careful, disciplined dance of coordinated infantry. But the matchlock had one obvious weakness everyone understood. It needed an open flame, always burning, useless in rain, a glowing giveaway in darkness, a constant, fragile liability even when nothing was happening at all. The wheel lock arrived in the early 1500s to solve part of that. A spinning wheel striking pyrite to generate sparks, no open flame required. Expensive, mechanically complex, and prized mostly by cavalry who needed a weapon they could carry loaded without tending fire on horseback. Then came the real breakthrough, the flintlock, generally credited to French gunsmith Marine Le Bourgeois, developed around 1610 to 1615. A spring-loaded hammer struck flint against steel, throwing sparks straight into the priming pan. Faster, more reliable in bad weather, no burning cord to give away a soldier's position in the dark. By the 1630s, it had spread across Europe, with the Dutch army among the first to adopt it as standard infantry issue. Within decades, it dominated nearly every major European military, a reign that would last roughly 2 centuries through colonial expansion, the Napoleonic Wars, and the American Revolution. Alongside the flintlock came another quiet revolution, the socket bayonet, introduced in the late 1600s. Unlike earlier bayonets that plugged into the muzzle and blocked firing entirely, the socket design attached around the barrel, letting a soldier fire and stab with the same weapon. Armies no longer needed separate pikemen for protection. Every soldier could now be both marksman and spearman, depending on the moment. It simplified training. It simplified supply. It reshaped how entire armies organized themselves on the field. And the sight of a bayonet charge alone, a wall of steel advancing in silence, often broke enemy morale before a single blow landed. The flintlock's 2-century reign finally ended in the early 1800s with the percussion cap, a small metal cap holding a shock-sensitive compound that ignited instantly when struck. No loose powder, no flint, no steel, just a spark exactly when needed. It made every mechanism before it, matchlock, wheel lock, flintlock, obsolete within a matter of decades, the final link in a chain that had started with monks chasing immortality 9 centuries earlier. From there, everything moved faster. Repeating rifles, advances in metallurgy and manufacturing, weapons that would have looked like sorcery to the soldiers who once stood in disciplined lines, matchlock cords glowing, waiting for their turn to fire. Step back far enough, and the whole story stops looking like invention at all. It looks like accident, accumulation, and migration, unfolding slowly across nearly 1,000 years. Nobody set out to build a firearm. A handful of monks searching for eternal life nearly burned off their own beards instead. Soldiers watching that explosion realized its violence could be aimed, first through bamboo, then bronze, then increasingly precise mechanisms built to strike a spark more reliably, more quickly, with less risk to the person holding it. Each improvement solved a real problem the last version had created. Bamboo to bronze, open flame to spring-loaded steel, matchlock to flintlock. None of it needed a single genius or a single moment of invention. It needed centuries, carried by trade routes, military campaigns, and the slow, almost invisible drift of knowledge between civilizations who never intended to be part of the same story. Chinese engineers, Mongol conquerors, Ottoman janissaries, Japanese gunsmiths, European craftsmen, each one adding a piece, rarely knowing how far the chain would eventually stretch. The weapon that ended the age of mounted knights, that rebuilt castle architecture from the ground up, that decided the outcome of colonial conquests and continental wars for centuries afterward, began its life as a mistake, made by people who were never trying to build a weapon at all.